Hello, and welcome to the final talk in our autumn-winter programme. I'm here in the museum's artefact store, where a large part of the collection not currently on display is kept safe. I'm surrounded by damask, antique furniture, lambeg drums, costumes, books, medals, archives, as well as some of the museum's extensive artwork collection. Again, given current government restrictions, it's not possible to live stream from the museum, so our talk tonight is pre-recorded. However, a number of you have forwarded me questions, and I will try and pose them during the Q&A. Tonight's speaker is Dr. Patricia Marsh, a medical historian and expert on the Spanish flu in Ireland.
My name is Patricia Marsh, and today I'm going to be talking about the Spanish influenza epidemic and its effect on Ireland, but in particular, what happened around Lisburn. So I'm going to start off with some basic facts about the flu. There were three waves of this pandemic and worldwide. The first wave was in the spring and summer of 1918, the second wave in the autumn and winter of 19, and the third wave in the spring of 1919. Now, almost every type of influenza pandemic is caused by the Influenza Air Virus, and this particular virus was a H1N1 virus, but unfortunately viruses were isolated until 1933. So at the time, most of the world was convinced this was a bacterial disease, and the culprit that they thought of the bacteria was Pfeiffer's bacillus. So anything that then, any forms of treatment or preventions were based on it being a bacterial disease. Now, the World Health Organization says that 50 million people died from this pandemic, but it could have been as many as 100 million deaths. Now, unfortunately, we'll not ever know how many people died from the flu because not all deaths were registered, or in certain cases, they were registered incorrectly. And what I mean by that is in certain countries like Australia, the indigenous population, the Aborigines or the Maoris in New Zealand, their deaths wouldn't have been registered, and that would have happened right throughout the world. So we'll never really know how many people died. So why was it called Spanish influenza? Well, influenza was thought to have originated in Spain. Now, Spain's neutrality during the First World War meant that there was no newspaper censorship in that country, and consequently reports about the disease were published in not only Spanish newspapers, but also other newspapers throughout the world. Articles such as this, as we see in the Sunday Times, which reported that there were 100,000 victims in Madrid of an unknown disease that was responsible for 700 deaths within 10 days. And this had caused disruption to public services, offices, factories, and King Alfonso XIII of Spain and other leading politicians had contracted the disease. Now, these reports give the erroneous impression that influenza had originated in Spain, and that led to it being dubbed the Spanish influenza. But the Spanish themselves were well aware that it hadn't started in Spain, and they themselves called it the soldier of Naples because they had known it had come from the Western Front. So where did it originate? There's a few theories on this. One theory was that it originated as early as the winter of 1916 on the Western Front at the British Army camp at Étape. Now, the outbreaks at Étape were diagnosed at the time as a disease called purulent bronchitis. And this purulent bronchitis showed similar symptoms to what we would later have seen in Spanish influenza, especially the symptom heliotrope cyanosis. And I'm going to explain a little bit about that later. And in hindsight, when they were writing the Ministry of Health report in 1920, they were of the opinion that both diseases were the same. Right. There were also theories, as there often are, that it developed in China and made its way with Chinese workers to the Western Front, or alternatively, with Chinese workers to the United States. And this is the most popular theory, is that it originated in the United States, as the earliest recorded outbreak of the disease was on the 5th of March, 1918, among Army recruits at Camp Funston in Fort Riley in Kansas. Now, by the end of March, it had spread to military training installations in several US, Midwestern and Southeastern states. And from here, it travelled with troops on quite crowded troop ships to the Western Front. And these would have been hotbeds of infection with many, if anybody had the flu and there was a lot of soldiers, young men together, it would have spread like wildfire through the ship. So what were the symptoms? Well, there were two sharply distinguished parts to this pandemic. During the first wave in 1918, there were many cases, but the mortality was relatively low. Patients recovered quickly after a short, severe attack, and it was widely described as influenza of the 3-day fever type. However, during the second and third waves in October 1918 and February 1919, there was high mortality from pulmonary and general septicemic complications. Patients complained initially about chest pains, had a short, dry, hacking cough. Their skin became hot, dry, and pungent, and occasionally a temperature rash like scarlet fever was noted. Breathing became rapid, and the pulse rate rose. The face was at first flushed and red, but then in severe cases, it became more and more lavender, heliotrope, or violet in colour. And this was the symptom that was known as heliotrope cyanosis. Now, during the second wave, heliotrope cyanosis was a prominent feature of the fatal cases. And this is where the sufferers' lips and ears would turn purple or blue, while the rest of their skin, first flushed, then turned pale white or grey, the colour of wet ashes. Now, the outcome of this would normally be death. Army doctors were content while the patient's face remained red, regardless of any other signs. However, when heliotrope cyanosis set in, then the prospect was very grave indeed. This symptom developed in less than half of the pulmonary cases, but once the patient had the prognosis, it was so bad that around 95% of these people died. Now, there's no doubt that heliotrope cyanosis was a very serious and noticeable symptom, but it didn't appear in all cases. The medical authorities at the Curragh military camp in County Kildare reported that there were only a very few cases of heliotrope cyanosis among their military influenza patients during the pandemic. And in Dublin, at the Mater Hospital, the resident doctor there, Dr. McNamara, he only found one case of the many that entered that hospital. So not everybody got this symptom. So other symptoms experienced during this wave were severe headaches, body pains and fever. Patients also coughed blood and bled from the nose. Bacteria invaded the lungs and turned those vital organs into sacs of fluid. And postmortems of victims showed that their lungs, as well as other major organs, were often filled with a solid red jelly. So it was a very, very unpleasant disease to get. So now I'm going to look a little bit at how it spread in Ireland. Now, there were three distinct waves in Ireland as elsewhere in the summer of 1918, the autumn of 1918, and the spring of 1919. Now, the earliest verifiable record in Ireland was an outbreak on the USS Dixie, which was docked outside Queenstown, now Cove, in May of 1918. That's just off Cork, in Cork. However, the outbreak in Cove appeared to be confined to the ship, as there's no evidence that it reached the town itself. Probably the authorities on the ship or the military on the ship would have quarantined the sailors and would have let them off, so it stayed confined to the ship. The first wave in Ireland proper was principally in Belfast and other districts of the north of Ireland. And around about the 12th of June, these notices appeared in the newspaper, and they were notices to get the young ladies who were working in the munitions factory of Mackey's in Belfast to return to work because their department had been closed down because they'd all got the flu. From Belfast, it spread east to Holywood and Bangor by the end of June, and southwest to Lisburn, Lurgan and Portadown by the middle of June. And it probably went to these towns via the rail network. There were also outbreaks in Ballymena and Ballymoney in the north of Ulster, as well as Derry, Enniskillen and Strabane in the northwest. By the end of June, the reports of flu in Ballinasloe, Tipperary, Dublin and Cork. And it's notable that there were army camps near these towns because the general consensus at the time was that influenza was spread by the military, by returning troops who were home either on leave or those that were wounded and were home convalescing in the military hospitals. And then once in the country, it spread via the rail network through the north of Ireland. Now, the second wave, it started in Leinster on Howth in the East Coast, and it was first reported on the 1st of October. It spread throughout Leinster to Dundalk, Drogheda, Wexford and Kilkenny by the end of that month. First reports of flu in Ulster were in Larne on the 9th of October, and it probably entered directly into Larne through the naval base that was present at the time. It reached Belfast during this wave by the end of October. Now, flu spread to most towns in Ulster, in fact, Ireland, during this wave, and this was the most virulent wave of the three for most towns. Donegal was severely affected on the west coast, unlike Mayo and other areas in the west of Ireland. Now, the lack of influenza in the rural parts of Connacht may be due to the absence of an extensive rail network there, but in Derry, there was the Derry and Lough Swilly line that went right through the county, so it was well serviced by a railway. Now, the third wave, which lasted from mid-February to mid-April 1919, originated again in Leinster and County Kildare, and then it spread to Dublin. Again, it visited most towns in Ireland, but in many such as Dublin, Belfast, Larne, Newry and Lurgan, this was a milder wave than those that they had in 1918. And this was thought to be because they'd gained immunity from the previous waves in 1918. There was a recurrence of influenza in County Donegal with a severe outbreak along the northeast seaboard of the county. And I have a map here of Ireland, and there's the shaded areas in this map show the counties in Ireland that had a higher mortality during 1919 than they did in 1918. And as you can see, the west of Ireland was much more affected in 1919 than they were in the previous year. This map also shows how flu would have spread across the country. So we have it coming in at the east in 1918 and spreading westward through to 1919. So how many people died? Well, speaking in 1920, the Registrar General for Ireland, Sir William Thompson, stated, and I quote, "Since the period of the Great Famine and its awful attendant horrors of fever and cholera, no disease of any epidemic nature created so much havoc in any one year in Ireland as influenza." And we have a table here which shows the death tolls for the 4 provinces in Ireland. And as you can see, Leinster and Ulster had the highest death tolls of 7,582 people dying in Ulster and 6,123 in Leinster. But Leinster had the highest death rate because it had a lower population than Ulster. Now, the official recorded influenza deaths for Ireland for the 2 years was this figure here, 20,057. But it could have been higher. And the pneumonia was a very common complication of influenza. And the Registrar General for Ireland suggested that excess pneumonia figures for 1918 and 1919 should be added to the influenza death toll. And that was around another 3,000 people. So it's more likely that the mortality from the disease was 23,000 people. However, again, the death toll in Ireland could have been much higher, as not all influenza deaths in Ireland were registered, and some were also registered incorrectly. And again, not everybody was registered when they died. For many reasons, maybe people forgot to do it. Maybe if a whole family was wiped out, that there was nobody there to register them if they died at home. And also, if by misregistration, I mean, if you had suffered from tuberculosis or bronchitis all of your life and you got the flu and then you died, the death certificate might have just said you died from TB. So not all deaths were recorded in that way. So how many people in Ireland contracted influenza? Well, the exact influenza morbidity will never be known, as accurate records of incidents of the disease were not kept at the time. However, it has been estimated that the mortality rate for this particular virus was 2.5% of those infected. So if you use this calculation on the official death toll from influenza of 20,000 people, as many as 802,000 people could have been infected with influenza during 1918 and 1919 in the island of Ireland, and 303,000 in the province of Ulster. And in the Lisburn Poor Law Union, which encompassed Drumbeg, Dunmurry, Ballyleeson, Glenavy, Hillsborough and Lisburn itself, as many as 9,000 people might have contracted influenza. So who died from the flu? Well, certain professions such as nurses, doctors, shop assistants, chemists, policemen, they were particularly vulnerable to the disease, and that's because they were dealing on a face-to-face with members of the public, so they were more liable to get the infection if somebody had it. But in industrial areas such as Belfast, Lurgan, Portadown and Lisburn, where there were factory workers, especially those working in close proximity in the linen factory, they were particularly susceptible to infection because once it was in the factory, it would have spread like wildfire through it due to the close crowded working conditions. And then once people brought it home as well, that they would give it to their family and then it would spread through their family. However, one of the global peculiarities of this pandemic was how it targeted young adults in particular. Now, normally influenza kills the very old or the very young, but the Spanish flu showed an unusual age distribution of deaths. Now, this slide shows the influenza and pneumonia deaths in the United States in 1917 and in 1918. And as you can see, in 1917, there's a typical U-shaped graph. So there's high death rates from the very old and the very young. But those people in the middle, they're not don't have as great a death toll. But in 1918, although you still have very high death rates above the very young and the very old, you have this unusual peak from the ages 20 to 40. Now that's very unusual for that age group to die in great numbers from an influenza pandemic. And in America, they found that this group was between 15 and 44. The same situation was true in England and Wales, where mortality seemed to be concentrated among those people aged 20 to 40, and particularly those aged 25 to 35. Now, it's been suggested that this peculiarity helped to produce Britain's lost generation. And that was caused by both the mortality of young men and soldiers fighting on the Western Front, as well as the death of the civilian population who were back on the home front, because that age group is particularly susceptible at home as well. And one of the tragedies of this disease was that many servicemen returned safely from war, only to contract influenza and subsequently die. And in Derry, during 1 week in November 1918, there were 12 influenza deaths reported in the military barracks where the disease was said to be rampant. In Ireland in 1918, 55% of all deaths from the flu were of people aged between 15 and 45. And in 1919, more than 58% of the total influenza mortality was between the ages of 20 and 65. And we have a slide here, it's my own graph, and it's the age-specific influenza death rates for Ireland for 1918 and 1919. And as you can see, Ireland followed the same trend, targeting young adults as well as the very old and the very young. But the Irish figures also show that infants under 1 year of age were also at particular risk during the pandemic. And this is hardly surprising, as even without epidemic disease, the urban areas of Ireland, such as Dublin and Belfast, suffered from one of the highest infant mortality rates in the United Kingdom due to infection and poor diet. And a lot of women, especially those who worked in Belfast in the mills, if they had a baby, they had to get back to work very soon afterwards, so they weren't able to breastfeed their children, and that caused a lot of the children to die in infancy. So why was this pandemic so detrimental to this particular age group? Well, there's a few theories. One theory is that the elderly people had gained immunity to the 1918-1919 pandemic from exposure to an influenza epidemic that occurred in 1847, which may have been caused by a similar H1 virus. Now, this doesn't explain the high death of older people in 1918, but it is a theory. Another is that young adults were more likely to attempt to work through illness, thus maximising their risk of succumbing to influenza. So in those days, if you didn't work, there wasn't any sick pay. So if there's no sick pay, you could not look after yourself, nor could you look after your family. So people worked through the disease or tried to work through the disease. But then that would be the case in any epidemic afterwards as well. So it could be a reason, but it's not the main one. Also, there was the theory that many of the age group 20 to 45 had been soldiers living on miserable conditions on the Western Front. And as I said before, there's no doubt that soldiers on the Western Front lived in awful conditions in the trenches and that they would have been very susceptible to disease. But again, we still have the same age group down in Ireland or England or other countries that hadn't been involved in the war at all. So A scientific study took place in 2007 on macaque monkeys, and it showed that those infected with the isolated 1918 virus experienced a rapid spread of flu throughout their respiratory system, causing them to die within days of each other. Damage that mirrored the reports of human patients in 1918. Now, the results showed that the 1918 virus caused the monkey's immune system to go into overdrive. So therefore, it could be the strong immune system of young adults that overreacted to the virus, causing that particular age group to be at most risk during the pandemic. Now, they're all valid theories, and maybe, but nobody has decided yet what the real reason was that this particular age group was so susceptible at the time. So I'm going to move on to what happened in Lisburn during the pandemic. On the 5th of July, the Lisburn Standard stated that influenza was rife in the town. It reported that doctors in Lisburn and district had never worked harder, but the death rate was normal. Day schools and Sunday schools were closed within the Lisburn district to help curtail the spread of the flu. Now, although it was reported that burials in the cemetery gave no cause for alarm, it also stated that a greater number of funerals than usual had passed through the town during that week. Now, during this wave, the Gill family from Dromore had some tragic deaths when 3 members of their family succumbed to the disease. Now, Mrs. Elizabeth Gill, aged 50, was a widow, and she died of influenza on the 30th of June 1918, followed a few hours later by her daughter, also called Elizabeth, and she was aged 25. During their funeral service, a telegram was received advising that a 3rd member of the family, Matthew Gill, aged 30, had also died from flu on the 2nd of July. Now, what made this story tragic was that the Gill family had also been severely hit by the war, as one son was killed on the Western Front, another was wounded, another was a prisoner of war, and there was a 4th who was still serving in the army on the Western Front. Now, the first wave in Lisburn peaked at the 6th of July 1918, but it had mostly died out by the end of that month. And there were 20 deaths from influenza or pneumonia in the town itself. On the 1st of November 1918, influenza reappeared in Lisburn. The Urban Council convened a special meeting of the Public Health Committee to help curtail the spread of the disease. The Council requested that the schools in the urban district close for at least a fortnight. And the national and the Sunday schools did close, and they remained closed until after Christmas. However, the Friends School in Lisburn remained open with tragic consequences. By the 31st of October 1918, all but 17 of the pupils who boarded and 2 members of the staff had contracted influenza. 3 pupils died. Helen Clark on the 31st of October, Anna McGowan on the 3rd of November, and Sadie Walsh on the 8th of November. It was only after the death of Anna McGowan on the 3rd of November that the school was closed and the remaining 16 pupils were sent home. The school then acted as a hospital for the remaining 6 students. The housekeeper, Emma McCulloch, aged 35, and the headmaster's daughter, Frances Ridge, aged 21, and a student who was home from Queen's, helped to nurse the students who were suffering from influenza in the school. Unfortunately, both these ladies lost their lives to the disease on the 10th and the 15th of November, respectively. And the school eventually opened again in early January 1919. Now, it was advised that although the doctors were being run off their feet, there's no cause for undue alarm. But at the same time, all possible precautionary methods should be taken. On the 8th of November 1918, the Public Health Department recommended that factory and workshop proprietors keep their premises thoroughly disinfected and ventilated, and advised the public to keep clear of crowded places and buildings that do not permit free ventilation. Now, in Ulster, even without the influenza pandemic, the working conditions in the linen industry were already notoriously unhealthy for the men and women who worked in the factories. Spinning rooms were hot and damp in order to prevent flax threads from breaking, which made them an ideal breeding ground for tuberculosis. Also, flax fibres covered spinners with a permanent layer of dust and caused serious lung damage. However, it was the enclosed factory environments and the crowded working conditions, such as those in the spinning and weaving sheds, that were a definite factor in spreading influenza to the men and women who worked in them. Now, during this wave, the McQuillan family of Colonwell, Dunmurry, in the Lisburn Poor Law District, succumbed to the disease. On the 13th of November 1918, Mrs. Mary McQuillan, aged 58, her son John, aged 32, and daughter Sissy, aged 29, all died within hours of each other. And John tragically died, leaving behind a young widow and an infant child. Now, this is one of the unrecorded tragedies of the pandemic, the fact that children can lose either one or both of their parents to influenza. And this would cause financial hardship if there was a single parent family, if a lady was left behind with children and she wasn't able to work, or in some cases, a husband not able to look after all the children might be farmed out to other relatives in the family. And if both parents died, well, there was very little a life for a child other than they would be going to an industrial school or to an orphanage if they couldn't find anybody else in the family to help them out. So it had far-reaching repercussions through the generations afterwards if your parents died during this pandemic. Now, the second wave peaked in Lisburn on the 16th of November 1918 and caused at least 40 deaths from influenza and pneumonia in Lisburn town. There were also 35 deaths in Ballyleeson, and this is where the Purdysburn Hospital was located. And if influenza got into an institution like that, it would spread very quickly among the patients and cause quite a few deaths. Now, the third wave of influenza did visit Lisburn, but there's very little reference to it in council minutes or in local newspapers. The main story that did get into the papers at that time was the lively debate that took place at the Lisburn Board of Guardians on the 20th of February 1919. Now, Mr. Scott, a member of the Finance Committee with strong temperance beliefs, came under great criticism, not only from the medical officer, Dr. Murphy, but also his pro-temperance Guardian colleagues in the union for not signing a requisition for alcohol for use in the workhouse infirmary. Now, the headline in the Irish News was "Whisky and Pneumonia, Extraordinary Attitude of Lisburn Poor Law Guardian, Doctor Strong Protest." Now, this intimated that Mr. Scott's behaviour was reckless in ignoring the doctor's medical advice. At the next Guardian meeting on the 11th of March, Mr. Scott defended his position. And according to the Standard, Mr. Scott said that he had been previously misrepresented. He had refused to sign an account for whisky which had already been supplied, rather than a requisition to provide new whisky. Nevertheless, Dr. Murphy did not retract his accusation. He believed that Mr. Scott's action had been the direct cause of an absence of whisky on the premises at the time because the supplier was reluctant to supply any more alcohol as the previous account had not been paid. It appeared it wasn't Mr. Scott's only objection or first objection to the use of alcohol for medicinal purposes. In June 1918, he complained about the quantity of whisky that was used at the workhouse hospital, despite Dr. Murphy advocating to his success in curing a case of pneumonia and typhoid. Now, the use of alcohol in influenza cases was widely endorsed to relieve pain and bolster strength. And in fact, the Ministry of Food regarded the shortage of spirits in some districts as a health problem. In February 1919, the Dublin Public Health Committee requested the War Cabinet to call for the immediate release of supplies of whiskies in the interests of public health. Now, during this third wave, Lisburn Urban and Rural Councils, as well as Hillsborough Rural Council, followed the Local Government for Ireland's recommendation and made acute primary pneumonia and acute influenza pneumonia notifiable, along with other more exotic diseases such as trench fever, malaria and dysentery. And this was because they knew the soldiers were going to be demobilised and be coming back into the country, and with that bringing these diseases with them. So they wanted, if these diseases came in, they wanted to know about them straight away. Now, this wave was the wildest wave in Lisburn town, as you can see from that graph, with 11 deaths from influenza or pneumonia occurring. So the epidemic occurred at a time of revolution in Ireland. So did the flu have an impact on this at this troubled time? Well, the global nature of influenza meant that Sinn Féin was unable to attribute blame for the disease onto the British administration. Nevertheless, their propagandists were adept at using any situation to their advantage. And the main focus of Sinn Féin's propaganda regarding the pandemic was with respect to the prison conditions of the Irish internees who were held in both Irish and British jails during this period. Some were incarcerated in Belfast jail on short-term sentences, while those volunteers and Sinn Féin members who were arrested and interned under the alleged German plot were held mostly in English prisons. Newspaper reports that over 100 Sinn Féin prisoners in the Belfast jail had contracted the flu during October 1918, prompted questions in Parliament as to their treatment. Now, Arthur Samuels, the Attorney General for Ireland, dismissed Sinn Féin's allegations of neglect and claimed that special treatment and diet were provided and 2 extra doctors have been engaged to assist in the prison. Now, Finian Lynch, one of the inmates in Belfast Jail during this period, later concurred with the official account. He recounted that both prisoners and warders were ill with influenza and that the cell doors were left open both night and day so that the more able prisoners could help those who were incapacitated. He attributed the prisoners' preferential medical treatment to Sinn Féin's highly efficient propaganda, as the British authorities wanted to avoid the negative publicity that would follow the prisoners' deaths. Now, during the pandemic, the mortality from influenza in Belfast for the 3 waves could have been as high as 2,300 people. Ironically, with not a single fatality among the prisoners, Belfast Jail seemed to be the safest place in the city during the epidemic at the time. In fact, only 1 prisoner died of flu in Irish prisons during 1918, and that was a female prisoner in Londonderry Jail, and her name was Martha Moore, and she came into the prison with influenza. Now, the Irish internees held in Usk prison in Monmouthshire was not as fortunate as those in Belfast. 6 Irish prisoners at Usk fell victim to the flu in late November, but they were not provided with regular access to a doctor until the 1st of December. Now, the death of Richard Coleman on the 9th of December reinforced Sinn Féin's allegations of prisoner mistreatment. Coleman had been a volunteer who fought during the Easter Rising at Ashbourne, and his death coincided with the general election due to be held on the 14th of December. Newspaper coverage of the circumstances of his death and Sinn Féin's orchestration of his funeral procession through the streets of Dublin brought the party valuable publicity. Now, Frank Gallagher, assistant in Sinn Féin's propaganda department, maintained that it turned the tide of public opinion by influencing undecided voters to vote Sinn Féin in the 1918 election, an election which was a landslide win for Sinn Féin, who won 73 of the 105 seats. During the 3rd wave in the spring of 1919, there were outbreaks of influenza in both Durham and Gloucester prisons. Again, there were many articles with respect to prison conditions, as several prisoners in Gloucester Jail, including Sinn Féin leader Arthur Griffith, had contracted the flu. However, it was the death of Tipperary East MP Pierce McCann on the 6th of March 1919 that was thought by many to have persuaded the authorities to order a general release of Irish internees held in British jails. Though in fact the order had been signed on the 4th of March, 2 days before McCann's death. The British authorities were very aware of the propaganda that was going on and the adverse publicity they were getting, and they were trying to set the wheels in motion to get the prisoners out, but not before Pierce McCann passed away. So what about cures and treatments? Well, unsurprisingly, as the real cause of influenza was unknown at the time, and there's still no known cure for the disease, there was little consensus among the Irish medical profession on the best treatment for or the prevention against influenza. This resulted in many cures and treatments being suggested. Now, some Irish doctors recommended gargling with a tincture of creosote or solution of permanganate of potash, chamomile as a purgative, oxygen, stimulants such as strychnine, and some preparation of opium for sleepiness. However, quinine was one of the most popular treatment choices, and I already mentioned that Irish Sinn Féin leader Arthur Griffith contracted influenza in Gloucester Jail, and he consumed a full bottle of quinine, and he advocated that it successfully cured his influenza attack. Now, at the time, when other prisoners saw him, they thought it could have killed him rather than cured him, but he did survive, and whether it was the quinine is a matter of debate. Recommendations for prevention of influenza appeared in articles like this in the newspapers, and the recommendations were things like breathe through your nose and not your mouth, make yourself sneeze night and morning, walk home from work, sleep with your windows open and your bed warm, and do not dope. Numerous attempts were made to create a vaccine, and this was a difficult task when the organism that caused the disease was an unknown one. The local government board for Ireland didn't advocate the use of vaccination or indeed supply vaccines to Irish boards of guardians for the use and treatment of the disease, as they were not confident the vaccine would confer immunity from influenza attack. Although they were probably correct in this assumption, it probably was more to do with finances that they didn't supply vaccines because of the cost, and they didn't want to incur that cost themselves. The truth is that the organism that caused influenza was unknown, and most of the vaccines were based upon the assumption that the disease was caused by Pfeiffer's bacillus. And so the success of any of these vaccines would be more by good luck than good design. Now, there were many newspaper adverts that appeared during the pandemic for many products that claim to prevent or to cure you from the flu. And as it was thought to be a bacterial disease, disinfection was considered a good preventative. Lifebuoy soap claimed to be a reputable germicide and a sure disinfectant. And a nationally established disinfectant proclaimed to guard against influenza by the daily use of Jez fluid. And disinfection with Jez fluid was one of the recommendations of the Dublin Medical Officer of Health, Sir Charles Cameron, in dealing with the flu. Oxo and Bovril were popular beef teas of the day, and they were thought to strengthen the body against the onslaught of disease. There was an assortment of advertisements for Oxo, like this one, during the second and third waves, which declared that it fortifies the system against influenza infection. So popular were these products that during December 1918, a series of advertisements apologised for the shortage of Bovril during the influenza outbreak. Now, Bovril was considered to be a very important form of nourishment during the epidemic, so much so that during November 1918, the Belfast Board of Guardians increased the nurses' Bovril's rations by 1/4 of an ounce per day to boost their diet and help them cope with their increased workload. Now, very many nurses within that union, but within the Belfast Union, caught the flu, and 4 of them died during November. So it didn't do a great deal to boost their strength and keep them on their feet during the flu. Now, snuff was advertised as a preventative, and Belfast tobacco firm Gallagher's recommended their high-toast snuff to prevent influenza or colds in the head. Now, this claim may not be as far-fetched as you think, because we already mentioned one of the popular recommendations to avoid the flu was make yourself sneeze night and morning, and snuff certainly would have helped you sneeze. But maybe the most extraordinary claim was by the Dunlop Rubber Company. They extolled the virtues of cycling with, I quote, "Very few of the people who have had influenza are regular cyclists. Those who bicycle regularly have been less liable to attack." Now, ironically, in County Louth, the champion cyclist and County GAA footballer, Joe Ross, died from the flu during the second wave. So, unfortunately, cycling didn't seem to be doing him much good to fight off the flu. In reality, there was no cure for influenza. The official response to the disease in Ireland was lacklustre, and that's hardly surprising, as throughout the United Kingdom, central government give little support or advice to local authorities on how to combat the disease. Arthur Newsom was the Chief Medical Officer for the local government board during the first wave of the pandemic, and he, along with the board, came under criticism for their lack of action, especially during the first wave. Newsom acknowledged that more could have been done during this wave. Measures such as isolating the sick from the healthy, prevention of mass migration and overcrowding should have been implemented, but he believed that this had not been possible due to the demands of war, as, I quote, "It was necessary to carry on, and the relentless need for warfare justified incurring the risk of spreading infections." In fact, it wasn't until the 15th of November 1918, after the armistice, that the local government board in Britain issued any recommendations on dealing with influenza in the form of this memorandum. And this memorandum was circulated to all medical officers in England, Scotland, Wales and Ireland. And the most effective preventatives against the flu were recommendations supplied in this memo. Recommendations such as avoiding crowds, thorough cleanliness, free ventilation and isolation of patients. Now, the best practical aid that could have been given to an influenza patient was bed rest and good careful nursing. However, nurses were in short supply, as many professional nurses volunteered to nurse for the war effort on the Western Front. And this situation was further exacerbated when Romanian nurses started to contract influenza themselves. Many nurses throughout the country contracted influenza and died from the disease. And I mentioned that 4 nurses died in Belfast. There was at least 2 in Derry and 2 in Lurgan as well that died performing their duties in the infirmaries. This lack of healthy nurses put a strain on the workhouse infirmaries throughout Ireland, and there was also a scarcity of temporary doctors throughout the country, again due to large numbers of practitioners serving on the Western Front. And as a result, union infirmaries suffered staff shortages throughout Ireland during the influenza outbreaks. And it was these hospitals and the dispensary system that were the main medical provision for the sick poor in Ireland during this period. The impact of influenza on these institutions was very great indeed. During 1918, the number of deaths in Irish workhouses rose by 3,329 on the previous year, with influenza and pneumonia deaths rising by 2,500. The workhouse infirmaries were extremely busy. Dispensary doctors worked long hours to treat patients, and they paid at least 100,000 more home visits during this period than in the previous year. And this indicated not only the virulence of the disease throughout Ireland, but also the work pressure that these dispensary doctors were under. And they were getting very little pay for this and very little rest. They just were on their feet all the time, rushing from one case to the next to the next. So, in conclusion, life in 1918 was much more tenuous, and most towns in Ireland were rife with epidemic diseases. There had been many casualties during the war, and there was political upheaval throughout the country. Life expectancy in Ulster was only 52 years of age. And although influenza claimed many lives throughout Ireland during 1918 and 1919, so too did other diseases such as tuberculosis. And tuberculosis continued to kill many people up until its eradication in the 1950s. In fact, the influenza outbreak in the summer of 1918 was the third epidemic disease that had occurred so far in the province that year. There had been a measles epidemic and a whooping cough epidemic earlier in 1918, which took the lives of many children. Epidemic diseases were taken as part of everyday life and death, and it appears that people just got on as best they could under the circumstances. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Patricia. That was really interesting. Very topical too. Obviously, we're living through a pandemic at the moment. Just before I get into some of the visitors' questions, can I ask you, what interested you in studying the pandemic?
Personally, I think I did a master's many years ago on archaeology, and I studied about the Black Death, and that sort of thing interested me, how a disease could just spread through the known world and kill so many people, and the people are still talking about hundreds and hundreds of years later. And then it was when I was doing a master's in Irish studies, I saw a documentary about the flu in Philadelphia. This is now about 2004, 2005, and I thought, gosh, I've never heard of this. Where did this happen? All of these people died. Did that ever happen in the UK? Did it happen in Britain? Did it happen in Ireland? And then that sort of spiked my interest, and I went to the newspaper archive, and I found, yes, it did indeed happen in Belfast. And then I thought, well, there's not very little written about this, so it piqued my interest to learn about it. And also because diseases affect everybody. You can be involved in a war or a revolution, but you can be minding your own business and get a disease and it'll kill you and cause many more deaths. As we said, there was 23,000 deaths in the flu in Ireland at least. And that would have been much more than happened in the Easter Rising, the Irish Civil War, the War of Independence put together. So, but that's just people getting on with their everyday lives. And we're sort of seeing it now in COVID, that people, that it's something that you have no control over because it's an invisible enemy. And what do we do to prevent it, and what do we do to stop it?
And what sort of records did you look at? Are there good records? I see you looked at the newspaper reports, but are there things like diaries, people recovering from it, or?
There is. I went to the official records. I was looking at the Board of Guardians and the council records about what happened in influenza, what happened in different towns right throughout Ulster, because my PhD was based on Ulster. And surprisingly, there is very little on there, because it's mentioned in meetings, but it's mentioned in passing now. In somewhere like Lisburn, 40 people are dying. It's quite a lot of people in the town at that time to die of a disease, and it's just getting passing. It's just got one line in the minutes. Oh, the doctor needs, some more medicine or something like that. The newspaper reports give you more, because you find that they would give an all-round view of what's happening in the town or somewhere else. But once a more interesting topic came along, like the general election or something else, then it fell out of the newspapers as well. And sometimes you'd only know it was in the town by looking at the adverts, because there'll always be the people selling you their potions and things at the back of the newspaper, and they kept going on. So you know, well, the flu must still be there because people are still looking cures. But yes, you're looking then at diaries. You're looking at what happened in other countries. You make comparisons, that sort of thing. But surprisingly little, because you know, even when you go to die, unless somebody had the disease, it'd just be, oh, well, the flu's on, so we couldn't do this, something was closed. I mean, I did read one diary, and the guy did mention the flu, and he said his sister had it, but then he went on for about 5 pages about the armistice celebrations in Belfast and what great crack there were and what was all going on. So that was the thing for him. So it's not always the thing that people focused on. And I think maybe in those days there were so many others, as I said, so many other diseases going on. It's just another thing that, you know, that these other big events are taking precedence in people's lives.
And are people still talking about this 10 years, 20 years, 30 years later?
Well, they're not. It's sort of called the forgotten pandemic in many ways. You know, when Alfred Crosby, who did a study on America, said that it was the forgotten pandemic there. Now, I think if you had somebody in your family that died of the disease, yes, there would be an awareness in your family history. But like, I didn't have, as far as I know, none of my ancestors died of the flu. Was never talked of. And other people, like people, when you tell them about, oh, I never knew about that. People know about it now because we got COVID and people are bringing it back in. But maybe 10 years ago when I started studying this, people said, I didn't know there was a big disease like that. It fell out of memory, and maybe because of when it happened at the end of the First World War, it goes into the collective memory of that event. And then in Ireland, it's sort of at the start of the revolutionary period, it's going into that. So people don't pay much attention. But you do find that in those cases where maybe a father or a mother died, that it goes through that family history, because the children or the grandchildren have suffered from it, you know, from poverty or some other reason, and so it stays within their collective memory. And Ida Milne, who's written a book called Stacking the Coffins, she has a very interesting chapter in that about oral histories that she's got, and histories of people, so we find out how it does affect a family going through the generations.
Yeah, because it's funny. I think one of the things that came out in your work, you mentioned that like Spanish flu was political. Mm-hmm. Far more people died from the Spanish flu than the Irish War of Independence. Yet there's plenty of commemorations for victims of the Irish War of Independence, but not flu. What about that? What is there a memorial? Has there been?
There's no memorial in Ireland. I don't know if there's many memorials anywhere, to be honest. I think there's I think it's in Westminster Abbey or Westminster Cathedral. I'm not sure which one. There's like one of the stained glass windows has a little graph, actually, that sort of graph I showed you of the peaks in London. It has it there. And in fact, in 2019, it was President Michael Higgins. He invited myself and Ida and Guy Biner and himself, and we had a seminar to commemorate in Ireland, because he knew that there'd be no commemoration. And again, President Higgins was personally affected because his mother's brother, when he was a child at school, at boarding school, he caught the flu and he died. So he would have a memory of it, and he was interested in it. And but that's the only sort of commemoration that there's been no official sort of stone put up to it or anything. And I think in very few places anybody has commemorated it like that. I know, like I don't know whether it's because it's a disease that people, you know, like the famine, you can maybe put something up to it because there might be a cause or there's something to blame. So like we were saying about Sinn Féin, they didn't have anybody to blame for the actual disease, but they could blame something on the way it was treated or where people were treated in it. You don't have an antagonist there that you can say, well, that's it, it's a disease. So, you know, who caused it or what caused it? You know, and in that way we have COVID, people trying to put the blame onto China and they call it the Chinese disease and that sort of thing. So, you know, it's a difficult question. There's many, many reasons as to why it's not remembered. Maybe diseases aren't commemorated more because there's nobody dying in a victorious death or being a martyr to a cause. You're just down because, and at that time you may thought you're down because you're frail or you're not very strong. Whereas in the case of this flu, that age group, who was the strong age group, were the people that were dying in abundance. So, no, that's not really answered it, but there's just many different reasons for it, yeah.
I suppose perhaps people at home are like this too. You were listening to your talk and hearing lots of parallels with the present day.
Yeah.
The museum ran a contemporary collecting project last year, trying to collect the history of the pandemic in our area. We collected all sorts of objects like face masks and hand soaps and letters, postcards, things like that. Are there any materials or objects that would be emblematic of the 1918 pandemic?
There really aren't. Even to find a photograph, you see the same photographs used all the time, and I use them myself. The one of that we used there of the Camp Funston, all the beds in the army camp. You get the photographs with the doctors and all with the masks, but they're not from Ireland. There's no photographs taken at the time of doctors or of people. There's maybe one cartoon that was in the Wellcome Library that was like a depiction of a great big monster and it's hitting somebody on the head with a hammer. And that's about the only thing. There wasn't much literature on it. People, no books or something, anything written. It wasn't until about 1939 when a book I think called The Pale Rider, was by Catherine Porter. It was published, and it was because she had the flu, and she did a fictional book based on her experience, of it. But it was one of those things. It wasn't I don't suppose maybe people did keep ephemera of that. The war and stuff. You could keep like little postcards if people were sent back from the Western Front, or whatever, uniforms, all sorts of different things, but. No, there wasn't really, and even like we have the thing about masks and all that we didn't in Great Britain or in Great Britain and Ireland, masks weren't advocated at all. So when you see those photographs of people with masks during the Spanish flu, they're from different countries. They're from America, or they're from Australia, or they're from Japan, where there were sort of rules on wearing masks, especially for the medical profession.
Was it not suggested as an option? Like nobody was out there as public policy, you should wear a mask, or were people resistant?
No, there's no public policy. That some medical officers of health, they sort of maybe suggested that there was a Dr. Niven in Manchester, and he advocated the use of muslin masks. But he was about the only one. There was a suggestion in Belfast and in Derry that, just in newspapers, but that it never did come to pass. And it was just like somebody said, maybe we should use masks. And I think doctors and nurses would have used masks because they were using masks anyway. But the masks they would have had wouldn't have been any good, particularly because they would have been cotton, they'd been quite thick, enough they wouldn't have been thick enough in the holes and whatever the virus would have got through. But no, they didn't advocate that. And I think I sort of mentioned it, that there wasn't much public policy from central government to help anybody. That memo that came out was all about preventions, as in you preventing it, not in the government or the authorities, but actually the individual. This is what you should do to stop it, and that's fair enough. But they weren't closing businesses, they weren't closing cinemas. The only thing they did close was schools, because as always, schools, that we know that the children do spread it really quickly. But cinemas were allowed to stay open, and then you would have had the kids who weren't going to school would have been going to the cinema, to fill in their day, or they're hanging around street corners, or they're going to funerals or to things like that. I mean, there was a lot of complaints at the time that you've closed the schools, but the kids are hanging around in other places with the disease. But that's about the only thing they actually did was school closures was one of their big recommendations, and then it was just like get by as best you can.
That came locally. That was like a local directive from the councils, the urban district and rural district councils in Ireland to close schools. Was that?
No, well, again, it was a recommendation, but most councils followed through on that one. Some may not have, and it would have had to have been as well, because I said about the Friends School, it was the national schools. It was like at that time would have been the primary schools. Secondary schools or grammar schools didn't close, and you find that happened in Friends. Also in Methodist College, it stayed open, and some of the boys and some of the masters died there. And as I said before about President Higgins, uncle, he died, and a couple of pupils died there because these schools stayed open. Whether that's to do with grammar schools thinking that they were more hygienic, or the children that went there were more hygienic, or less liable to get epidemic disease and spread it, I don't know. But certainly they were never. The recommendation was there, and then the schools either did it or they didn't do it. Most of them did do it because I think they closed. In Derry, they were closed before the influenza pandemic because they had the measles epidemic, so they had closed then. So it was like schools were closed a lot because there was a lot of these diseases flying about at the time.
I suppose one of the peculiar features of the pandemic we're living through now is denial, either denial of science or denial that there's actually a pandemic going on. Was there anything equivalent in 1918, 1919?
It wasn't so much they were in denial that there was something going on. They were in denial as to maybe what it was. There would have, there would have been, especially during the first wave, this flu, if that's what it is, that they knew there was something, and there was a lot of, even then there was sort of rumours, was it germ warfare, was it set by the Germans on U-boats? There was lots of fanciful sides. Was it trench fever? In fact, one of the things was a trench fever come back with the soldiers, and that would have been part of maybe the more nationalist papers would have been sort of associated the flu with the war, and because the anti-conscription was going on at that time, and they were trying to, venereal disease was a big thing but they weren't allowed to say anything about venereal disease. So I think they sort of tried to slot in the flu because it was coming back with soldiers, and then it was a dangerous thing that if everybody went off to war, they'd come back with these awful diseases. So there was more of that. They weren't in denial because they could see people were dying. So there was no way they knew that the disease was there, and probably because it was affecting more than the usual suspects, more than the old and the young. It was affecting that 20 to 40 age group as well. There was no denying it. So there wasn't really not so many conspiracy theorists in those days as we have now.
So how did people react after the pandemic was over? Was there, they're talking now about we could be going into a new roaring 20s, people are let out from restrictions and able to spend money and live life again. Was there an equivalent?
I don't think so, because they didn't really close down. Basically, what we have done now didn't happen then. A factory would have closed down, or a shop would have closed down, or a business would have closed down because the people were sick and they couldn't open it up to run the business. But once those people were back in work, it was up and running again. So, but I think it's hard to tell because you had a war and then you have the flu. So anything that happens in the 1920s, and then you have a revolution. So you have a lot of things happen, especially in Ireland, that that they all fold into one. So if the economy, did it get better or worse? Would that be because of the war? Would that be because of the flu? Is that because of the thing? So I think because of the period of especially in Ireland, that we got a restless period politically, that maybe people didn't see that much difference. Certainly things like the linen industry and places like that they had thrived during the war because there was a need for linen for airplanes and all this, and then that sort of once the war was over, there wasn't a need. So a lot of the guys there were sort of going on reduced hours and things, so they probably were worse off, but it was because of the war rather than the flu. It's just the way it tags on to the end of that really big major world event that it's hard to pinpoint if it was the cause of anything afterwards, or was it the war.
You mentioned Donegal provides an interesting case study. We can talk about it a bit more.
Well, Donegal, as I said, it suffered quite highly from high deaths during 1918 and during 1919, and it's a very rural area, so it had some of the highest death rates per thousand of population, higher than Belfast, certainly, because although Belfast had more people dying per population, it was lower. And at the time, they didn't really know, but we have a thing in Donegal, and I don't know if it still goes on, but it did go on then, certainly seasonal migration, and that's where a lot of the young people went over to Glasgow to go to help with the potato picking or whatever else. And when they went over when it was the height of the pandemic, and a lot of them got the flu in Glasgow, and they died. And then their bodies were brought back to Scotland, from Scotland to Donegal. And it wasn't so much that their bodies contained the flu or anything else, but they were wrecked, and they were wrecked in quite small buildings, cottages. And this whole idea of going to a wake, shaking the person's, first thing you do is shake somebody's hand. I'm sorry for your loss. So if anybody had the flu, they straight away giving it to somebody, and then it just passed around everybody that was there. And then they went back to their rural cottages, which maybe had 10 people living there, and I'm not exaggerating on that. And then it would go like firework, like spread like wildfire through that house. And there was one certainly case that there was about, I think, the mother and the father and at least 6 of the children got the flu. The whole house got the flu, but at least the mother, the father, a lodger that they had there, and 3 of the children died of flu. And it was like just out in the country somewhere. So the only sort of reasonable thing is that they're getting it because they're congregating at wakes. And the reason that there were so many wakes was because the guys were down in Scotland and not bringing the disease back with them, but bringing the bodies back to be buried. And then that meant that there was a lot of more people congregating for wakes and stuff. And we found out at the beginning of COVID that one of the biggest outbreaks in Italy was because of a funeral. So it's that congregating of people, and because it's a sad occasion, people shaking hands and giving condolences, and in a packed together, that an infection will just spread right through it.
It's very sad that. Finally, last question. So you wrote in 2009 that the looming threat of an outbreak of a new influenza pandemic has reawakened general interest in the Great Flu. So have you seen a resurgence in interest in the Spanish flu since COVID?
Certainly. Now, we did have the 100th anniversary in 2018, 2019, and I sort of thought, well, that's the end of the interest in that. Nobody's going to be interested anymore. But yes, you have seen that, because there's so many parallels. And the advice that they were given back in 1918 is good advice today. Keep out of crowds, keep everything ventilated, isolate if you're sick, don't go to work. All of these sort of advice that is good advice today. If you can get a vaccine, get a vaccine. Now, people want, as I said, the vaccines they had, they weren't going to be much good in those days because they just didn't have the science, but they do have the science now. So, you should be fairly confident in that sort of thing. But yes, there is a lot of interest, because even in 2009, when we wrote that, there was a flu outbreak, the Mexican flu, I think it was called the time, or swine flu. And there were a lot of interest was raised again then, because it was thinking, oh, is this going to be it? Is this going to be the next pandemic? Now, it didn't escalate in the way that I'm not going to say they hoped, because they didn't hope it, that they thought it might escalate, and it's sort of, maybe more people have immunity, or, they'd better preparedness in place. Because this pandemic here is it's not a flu, it's a completely different virus, that everybody's just on the back foot trying to learn about the virus itself and how to combat it and how to treat it. Whereas in 2009, we probably had enough science there to maybe stop it in its tracks a wee bit, But yes, there's definitely been a lot more interest in the flu and these sort of pandemics, because this is really the biggest one that's happened since, definitely.
So I'm going to sneak in a final question. You've studied this extensively. Is there any comfort that we can take from the 1918 pandemic and apply it to today?
That's a hard one now. Well, the comfort is that it fizzled out eventually and it disappeared, and a lot of viruses do. And I don't know how long this would. I will say up front, I'm not a scientist as such. I'm a historian. But, that things mutate. Sometimes they mutate and they become more virulent, and some of the times they mutate and they become less virulent. They become weaker. So you've got a lot of people out there. You've got a lot of good scientists, good people that know what they're doing. And we maybe just have to sit back and let it run its course. But maybe they'll find a way of stopping it. But certainly if we can get vaccines and we can get things like that and get back to life, some sort of normality, try and save our vulnerable people, and then the rest of us, we feel confident enough to go out and start living again. I suppose because in 1918 they would have had none of this. They'd have just ploughed on, which is probably why there was such a high death rate. They just had to keep going. They had no other options but to do that. So I think there is hope, definitely. Whether it's from what I've learned in 1918 or just whether I'm a hopeful person, I'm hopeful it'll all, in a few years' time, it'll just be a bad memory. like the 1918 flu, just a bad memory.
Study COVID in a PhD 100 years from now.
Some other person.
Thanks very much for your time. It's a really
problem.
important conversation, and really grateful for you to talk today.
Okay, thank you.